Do you? There's a bit in your book about sort of propaganda and how the dynamic within democracy of sort of getting the people to follow along with leaders. Do you? So I'll use that as the preface to this question. Do you read weblogs? And do you think the Internet will ultimately be a force for good, in parentheses they write education, or a force for propaganda, or something in the middle, meaning more of the same of what we have right now?
Well, the Internet is intensifying all aspects of what you've just described. So it does provide means to evade the extraordinary pressures of a very narrow doctrinal system in the United States. There are ways to get around it. On the other hand, the Internet also includes plenty of hysteria and tantrums and wild claims without evidence and so on. So it allows all sorts of things. It's not controlled, which is good. That means it has all sorts of characteristics. As for the propaganda, it is quite striking. So just take September 2002 again, very important month. The government announced the national security strategy, virtually announced the invasion of Iraq, which was to exemplify it. And also that initiated a massive government media propaganda campaign, which very quickly drove American public opinion completely off the spectrum of international opinion. Within a few weeks, a majority of Americans regarded Saddam Hussein as an imminent threat to the security of the United States. Even the people who most hated and despised him didn't believe that. So in Iran and Kuwait, the two countries he invaded, they're happy to tear him limb from limb, but they didn't regard him as a threat. That was ridiculous. The weakest country in the region. It had a third the military expenditures of Kuwait, which was 10% of its population. It was devastated by sanctions. It was disarmed. A monster, but not a threat. However, in the United States, people were very quickly driven to regard him as a threat. In fact, shortly after, Americans alone in the world came to believe, many did, majority in fact, that Saddam Hussein was somehow responsible for 9/11, or that he was involved with Al-Qaeda. I mean, the intelligence agencies don't believe that. These misunderstandings, which are gross, have been studied in detail by the leading polling agency in the country, the world, the Program of International Policy Attitudes at the University of Maryland. They found extraordinary misperceptions among Americans, and they traced them to the news sources that the people used. It's quite revealing. People might want to look it up.
Oh, and it'll be interesting to see. I can't help but wonder how the dynamic will change. Again, if Saddam reveals weapons of mass destruction, there's this memo recently uncovered in, I forget the British paper, The Telegraph, I think, about Muhammad Atta training in Iraq. If these connections are established after the fact,
that would change absolutely nothing.
Uh-huh.
So, for example, suppose that when Russia invaded Hungary in 1956, they later discovered that there was a Hungarian terror cell planning something in Russia. Would that have justified the invasion? I mean, plans, the resort to violence is justified on the basis of what is known at the time, not on what you discover later. It should be obvious. It's astonishing to me, very astonishing, that they have not been able to find weapons of mass destruction. In fact, if you want my secret suspicion, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they've already discovered something and are holding it back to reveal at the proper occasion for propaganda purposes. That wouldn't surprise me in the least. The administration has a record of deceit and lying that is just astonishing. But it's not relevant. I mean, even if there was a concern over weapons of mass destruction, they knew precisely how to deal with it, namely permit the UN inspectors to continue to their operations, which were extremely successful in eliminating Saddam Hussein's military capacities, far more successful than the invasion's been, in fact. But the fact is that you can learn this from intelligence agencies or virtually all foreign policy analysts. It was anticipated and predicted that the invasion of Iraq would increase proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and would also increase terror. And apparently that's happened. There are ample reports of that. It was predicted, and it seems to have happened. And the reasons are pretty obvious. When you inform people that you're planning to attack them without credible pretext or any kind of authorization, they don't just say, thank you, please cut my throat. They resort to whatever means of deterrence they have. And for the weak, the means of deterrence happen to be terror and weapons of mass destruction, which will sooner or later be unified. And if we continue to stimulate terror and proliferation by actions such as invading Iraq and others, we continue to do that, it will very likely bring about the serious terrorist attacks right here, as has been predicted for years, incidentally, in technical papers long before 9/11.
Something I've been wondering about lately, with half of the country so vehemently opposed to Bush, and the other half so vehemently in support, it almost feels like half the country disenfranchised, their interests not represented on important matters. Is democracy not scalable to a certain point? Does there come a point where the population is too big to be represented by a single government?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the population is disenfranchised, but not in the ways that you're describing. And in this regard, there are very detailed and expert studies of U.S. public opinion. We know a lot about it from academic sources and others, and about since the Reagan years, a large majority of the population believes that they are not represented, that the way the polls stated is the governments work for the few and the special interests, not the people. I mean, that reached 80% under Reagan. If you look at the attitudes towards elections, well, I mean, take a look at the attitudes towards the year 2000 election, not afterwards, but before. So no Florida shenanigans, no Supreme Court. About 75% of the population simply didn't take the election seriously. They thought it was some game carried out by rich contributors in the public relations industry who train candidates to keep away from issues and say things that are meaningless. In fact, if you look at polls, the public is disenfranchised on issue after issue. Take, say, the big story last week, the Medicare bill. According to the last polls I saw, Washington Post a couple of weeks ago, about 80% of the population are in favor of raising taxes to guarantee health care to everyone. That's called politically impossible in the United States, because the pharmaceutical corporations and the insurance companies won't accept it. Doesn't matter what people feel about it. And that's true on many, many issues. That's disenfranchisement. It has nothing to do with the scale of the country. It has to do with the deterioration, or the erosion of democratic culture, which has come about quite consciously. It's been carried out. It's a project carried out by concentrated power, and it's had some success.
Professor Chomsky, I appreciate you taking this time to chat with us, and as we come to the end of our time, I wonder maybe if you'd like to wrap us up with closing comments.
only closing comment I'd like to make is that we have the honesty and integrity to look at ourselves, to understand who we are, what we do, what the reasons are for it, and to evaluate what the likely consequences are going to be. Not take my word for it, figure it out for yourself.
Thanks very much. Thank you for your time.
Right. Bye.
Bye now. Many thanks to our guest, Noam